Hello, everybody. Welcome to Iron Culture presented by Mass. It is Monday night my time. Who knows what time it is for the esteemed gentlemen that are joining me? It's really impossible to say. But anyway, it is absolutely a pleasure to be here as always. And what a treat, because I am joined not only by the good Dr. Helms, but also by our colleague, our dear friend, Dr. Martin Refalo, who was really the brains behind our recent meta-regression, which covered protein intake with many caveats and details and qualifiers and so on. But before we get into all the big stuff, I just want to welcome everyone. Martin, since you're new here, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
So it's my 11 a.m. here in Melbourne. It's nearly 33 degrees, so it's getting pretty hot, and I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
And that's 33 degrees Celsius, which
yes.
is actually, interesting fact, cannot be converted to Fahrenheit.
Really?
Yeah, not by me, not by anyone I know, but I'll take your word for it that it's warm.
It's hot.
And Martin, why don't you tell the good folks about your background? Tell them about yourself, where you've been, what you do, all that kind of stuff.
For sure. So I recently graduated from my PhD, supervised by Dr. Jackson Fife here in Melbourne, and my external supervisor was Dr. Eric Helms. We were, fortunate enough to be able to conduct many studies across the PhD period, which I know sometimes students don't get the chance to do, especially during COVID. It was very hard, so I was fortunate to have a good experience. And since graduated, I conducted a lot of research looking at the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy. And this really is really marks the decade of me studying exercise science. And throughout that whole time period, I've also been working in the industry. Varying from full-time to part-time, doing what I can to balance both. But I'm also a full-time coach, both face-to-face and online. And I work with a wide range of individuals, specifically interested in working with bodybuilders as well, which is where a lot of my kind of passion and interests come from. It's just that iron culture, that bodybuilding culture that I've grown up with. So, looking forward to chatting about our recent paper today.
Well, I'll tell you what, you name drop the show name. That's a good way to ingratiate yourself with the audience right off the bat. So very well done.
Yeah.
Helms, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Just a couple of really important points is I will confirm that you did recently acknowledge that you have said that the prior Trex catalog of iron culture has become canon, right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So that was a statement and that you still hold that to be true. Well, then, I want to welcome back now Dr. Martin Refalo, because he was actually on episode 197 where he talked about training to failure, which he did some really great work on, which I was privileged to be a part of. So just big congratulations, because since then he has become a doctor. He finished his PhD. He did a great job with it, published a lot of great work, and has really done a lot. Something I can say about Martin is that he really does very good work and very hard work, and he's very diligent to try to make sure what he does applies and is helpful to the community, and he's part of the community. He's an academic, he's a coach, he's a researcher. It's hard to wear all those hats, and we're so glad to have you back on, and thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, great to have you. And I tell you what, the good people in last week's episode had a lot of questions. So Martin, if you don't know the rundown, iron culture, things have changed around here. Now we do many of our episodes live on YouTube. They go up on podcast platforms, usually on Wednesdays. But Monday nights we go live. We get real questions live in the chat from our listeners. And there were a lot of folks asking about the meta-regression project that we did. Okay. Helms and I obviously were part of that. It was a 3-person publishing team, but Martin, you were the lead author. You were the person crunching the numbers, punching the buttons, so to speak. And you really were there's no question, you put the most weight behind this project. You were the leader. And so we said, you know what? We're going to have Martin on the show. No point in us answering these questions yet, because Martin is going to be, our fearless leader once again, and we can kind of go through the paper, what we did, what we found, and then maybe address some of the questions that have come up. And, maybe there's been some discussion online. Maybe some of it has been critical in nature. So maybe we can address some of the criticisms that have been brought up and talk about exactly how unfair and inaccurate that they truly are. Not to be biased, okay? Not to be biased or foreshadow my perspectives on them. But Martin, to start us off, why don't you, if memory serves, you are the person who came up with the project, like you initiated this project, right? Is that right? Or did Helms do it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's Helms' fault.
Well, I was invited by Dr. Escalante. I think we both were invited to take part in the special issue.
Yeah.
Shout out to Helms, and then Helms had the idea. Yeah.
Helms had this. So Helms, this is your fault. So Helms, I guess we'll start with you then. The question is, how did we get into this mess? What was the impetus for this?
Well, we got into this. Actually, I specifically remember this specific paper. I will say we got into it while I was doing, I think it was towards the end of my contest prep in 2023. And I messaged you and I said, I think we might have enough data now to redo the systematic review that I did with the semi-quantitative look at protein intake while dieting way back in my master's, my first entrance into the research in 2012, 2013, full press 2014, with meta-regression, maybe meta-analysis. What do you think? And you said, I agree. That's a great idea. I have no time. Do you have any time? And I said, absolutely not. That's why I reached out to you. And I said, all right, let me keep thinking about this, and we'll see who might be a good person who could work with us on this. And only a couple months later, that's when the SCJ, Strength Conditioning Journal, put its feelers out and say, hey, is anyone interested in doing some invited reviews? I reached out to Martin and I said, hey man, you're on the other side of that PhD. You don't have the gorilla on your back. Would you be interested? Because he has done some meta-analysis, really picked that up really quickly, already worked with you, Dr. Trexler. Maybe we could tackle this. And since you and I, Trex, were time short, but very interested in this topic, have worked in it, it's, arguably my principal area of expertise and an area that you've worked in a lot as well. If we could, combine forces, we can update the systematic review I did over a decade ago. So that's where it all started.
Yeah. And so Martin, with the introduction out of the way, a very intuitive way to kind of pick up where your paper from a decade ago essentially left off. Martin, if you want to give a quick rundown, maybe you can tell the good people about our general approach to the methods, just a basic quick overview of what we did procedurally speaking.
Okay, cool. So I guess there's many layers to what we did. We could probably spend hours just speaking about the methods.
Why don't you just read the methods section word by word? I think podcasts, that does really well.
Yeah, try not to change your inflection. You want a steady monotone, speak and flow. Yeah.
Look, I'll give you guys a bit of a summary, and there may be some aspects that might not be as important or as interesting to some of the listeners. I guess understanding the statistical approach to an extent can help people better interpret research. So it's probably in your best interest, if you are like an avid fitness enthusiast who follows research, just to kind of pay attention to when, we speak about stats. Most people, touch on methods these days in podcasts. And so I feel like sometimes individuals kind of ignore that because it's the boring and maybe not, important side of things. People want the conclusions, they want the findings. But yeah, I think it pays to have a basic understanding. So what we did is we initially planned to conduct a meta-analysis and a meta-regression, and we pre-registered that. And really, it's not until you obtain the data set that you know what you can do with it. So although you generally try and stick to the pre-registered methods, sometimes you have to deviate slightly. So although we retrieved 29 studies in our systematic search, less than a handful of them actually compared groups with different protein intakes, right? So in meta-analysis, what we're trying to do is compare two different groups, right, within the same study, so similar demographic, completing the same training program, same energy deficit, etc. But most of the studies that we retrieved had multiple groups with the same protein intake, so they weren't actually comparing differences in protein intakes between the groups, but rather differences in meal frequency or deficit size or rate of loss. And that's how the groups differed, not based on protein intake. So we had to scrap our idea of conducting a meta-analysis, and instead we did a meta-regression, which compares all groups across all studies. So for example, we might compare a high protein intake group in study A versus a low protein intake group in study B. But of course, because we're comparing these groups across different studies, there are limitations to that. There is between study variability that we have to acknowledge. So for example, what if participants in one study were training 5 days a week, right? And the other, they were only training twice. Well, that's what we can call a confounder. And in our statistical approach, we would also call that a covariate if we wanted to account for its impact on the overall relationship. So basically all the variables that differ between studies that we think can impact the results are called covariates. So what we aim to do with our statistical analysis is better understand how the predictor, right, which is protein intake, better understand how protein intake predicts changes in fat-free mass, right? And we also try to account for some of those covariates that are outlined earlier, or what some people may call confounders. But of course, this also comes down to what we can retrieve from the studies that we actually had. So for example, many of the training characteristics in these studies were poorly reported. So it was hard for us to derive the exact training frequency or volume that these studies were instructing participants to complete. In some cases, for example, off the top of my head, there were 16 studies that instructed participants to just continue on with their current training program. So we actually couldn't extract any training characteristics with a degree of confidence that we deemed sufficient to account for within our statistical model. So something for people to kind of keep in mind, which we can maybe circle back to later on. And I guess when you're trying to understand relationships between, a dependent variable and an independent variable, and that's basically what we're trying to do here, is you have to decide how you are going to model that relationship. And there's many different ways in which you can conduct meta-regression. So whether it's going to be a linear model that you choose to conduct, maybe it's going to be a non-linear model, and then if it's non-linear, well, what polynomial shape is it going to have, which we can kind of circle back to in a second. There's a lot of questions that start to arise when you're working your way through this process and deciding how you are going to try and model the relationship. And I guess what we did is we chose to take both a linear approach, so we modeled the relationship linearly, and also non-linearly. And what this means basically is that a linear model assumes that there's a straight line relationship between the two variables we're looking at, right? So an increase in the protein intake always comes with an increase in the outcome, which is fat-free mass change. And that's a linear relationship. But with a non-linear model, what we can do is we can actually explore potential curvature in the relationship. So this is where basically the effect of a predictor, in this case protein intake, changes across different values. So you can kind of think of a regression line that starts to showcase some sort of diminishing returns. So we tried to capture the best relationship that we could grasp from the data with those different models. But again, there's multiple different layers that can kind of come into play here, right? So when you add covariates into these models, you need to be careful not to add too many of them because that can lead to overfitting. And so we only chose 4 covariates to add into these models: body fat levels, intervention duration, participant sex, and calorie deficit size, right? So they were the covariates we add into some of the models. But then we also ran the models without the covariates too. So again, there's a lot that goes into the statistics here. And basically what we try and do at the end of the day is we try and work out under which model the data is most probable, which model generalizes to new data the best, and which model does all of this with the least complexity. And this is a really important point, especially considering the approach we took. We took what we can call an exploratory approach. Now, the reason we did this is because we knew that there was a lot of between study variability, right? And meta-regression is just generally, in most cases, more exploratory than meta-analysis. And so we wanted the end model, to be the most parsimonious, which means it provides us with the level of explanation we are after, again, with the least complexity, because we were trying to explore the data, recognize patterns in the data. And again, this doesn't mean that the results are unreliable. It just means that we're keeping our focus on pattern recognition in areas that are yet to be explored. So this is a very niche area. All our secondary analyses were very niche. They're yet to be explored. And all we're trying to do with our modeling is recognize potential patterns, keep it simple so that we can interpret it well, we can convey the results well in discussion to the wider community, and set up future research, and hopefully provide some just very rough recommendations in an area that hasn't been explored all that well. We have the Helms review from 10 years ago, which was qualitative. This now builds on that with a quantitative approach, but we're still acknowledging the limitations to that, and we're making it clear that what we're doing isn't confirmatory.
I think that's really well said. Some of the things that I think are challenging for people to understand without knowledge in this area is some of the differences in terminology. Just knowing that all meta-analyses are systematic reviews, but not all systematic reviews have meta-analyses, and that while a meta-regression is in the family of a meta-analysis, there's a distinct difference between a comparison between controlled trials that have done an intervention that we have meta-analyzed because we go, yep, these have a sufficient, at least similar inclusion criteria, same experimental outcome, and same variables, and we can meta-analyze them. And more importantly, it's responsible to do so, because technically, you can do a meta-analysis on 2 studies, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you should or not is a harder question. I think we have 5 that met our inclusion criteria. So we took really careful effort in our wording to describe this as, like you said, exploratory rather than confirmatory. And the way I when I was helping construct the paper with you guys, I said, hey, listen, we have this decent evidence bar of my systematic review, but that only had 6 studies in it, and it was at best a semi-quantitative analysis. We're going to take a step forward. We have enough to say something more to kind of test that, because science is about disconfirming hypotheses. And one thing that we were very open to was actually what you thought you were seeing in these 6 studies that you qualitatively looked at. The meta-regression should at least be able to disprove that. If we're not seeing anything, then listen, hey guys, scrap this one up to, reasonable hypothesis, but no data to support. But I think we're still climbing the ladder. And I think that is one of the most important things people can take away from this meta-regression, is that we are moving towards better evidence. This might be the best evidence we have on, what's a decent protein intake range for when you're in a deficit and you're lifting weights and you're considering, body composition as a part of it. But this is by no means the final word. And I think all of us are very open to the idea that this could change over time with more data. We don't currently see that in our models, but that doesn't mean that our models will never change based upon additional data. And I just think those are really important points. And there's a reason why we pre-registered this, why all the data is open access on Open Science Framework. You can look at our code. And this is something that we want people to look at and build upon as more data comes out. So yeah, I think that's it. This is not the most fun part, to jump right into the methods to kick things off, but I think it is really important. And Trex, you did a great job of working on this with your extensive background in meta-regression analysis as well.
Yeah, I did a little bit. Martin would kind of bounce ideas off me, and I would throw my 2 cents in there. But I certainly don't want to steal any of Martin's credit, as he put by far the most weight behind this thing, the most effort into it. But yeah, Martin, I think you did a great job kind of explaining the methods, and I think probably it's a good time to maybe just kind of hit the high level findings so that we can kind of go off from there, talk about some criticisms, talk about why they're completely baseless and fraudulent, and then maybe open up to some questions in the live chat.
Okay, for sure. So it after we did, what I can just briefly summarize here is like an extensive model comparison, which accounts for a few different things, like I described earlier. How probable is the data under a specific model? How well does it generalize to new data? And, can it do these things with less complexity. Basically, the linear model came out on top. So remember, with the linear model, we're not seeing any curves in the line. It's just that straight line relationship. And it was also the most parsimonious in the sense that the linear model without the additional covariates seemed to explain just as much as the linear model with the covariates. So remember, when I say with the covariates, I'm saying that model accounted for intervention duration, calorie deficit size, baseline body fat, and participant sex, right? That's that model. But the linear model without the covariates, it explained just as much. So again, we selected that one because it was the simplest and it gave us what we wanted, a zoomed down view of the overall relationship between protein intake and fat-free mass change. And this was the case for protein expressed relative to body mass and relative to fat-free mass as well. So we analyzed both protein prescriptions, you could say. The kind of one sentence summary would be that what we found is that as protein intake increases, so does favorable fat-free mass change in a linear manner. That's what we observed, of course, within the ranges of protein intakes that were analyzed by the available studies. And when I use the word favorable, what I mean is either less fat-free mass loss or more fat-free mass gain. So consuming more protein was shown to help people lose less muscle or help them build more muscle or fat-free mass. To kind of determine, the magnitude of effect, because that's what people will often ask as well, how potent was that effect? What we do is we interpret what we call the median slope. So again, it might sound kind of boring, but it's important. So the slope is basically the rate of change in the outcome per unit increase in the main predictor. So in this case, how much does fat-free mass change per 1 gram increase in protein intake? And this is expressed as like an effect size, really. But our Bayesian approach doesn't ever just spit out one number. It doesn't ever just give us like one effect size. It gives us what we call a posterior distribution. So you could imagine like a bell curve of all the possible effect sizes. Somewhere in the middle is probably going to be our best bet. And that's what we call the median slope, right? So it's the typical effect size in that posterior distribution that we can, place our bets on. And then we also get a credible interval, as we would often get even in like a frequentist approach. You might get a confidence interval. In this case, we get a credible interval. So, there is a 95% chance that all the plausible effect sizes fit within that credible interval range. And that's important. So it's important to know that, because I'm going to circle back to that in a second. Now, the effect size, right, that the magnitude of effect for both protein prescriptions was quite small. So it was around 0.07, 0.06. And so increasing protein intake, although there was a positive association between doing so and favorable fat-free mass change, it was what we can call a small effect by traditional, effect size standards. The one thing, or a few things, I guess, differed between the protein prescriptions. So for example, when we looked at protein in grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, that credible interval I was speaking about, it didn't cross 0. So this means that all the plausible slope values, right, all the plausible effect sizes were positive, right? So they all suggested a consistent positive direction. At no point was there any suggestion of like no effect or a negative effect. Whereas with protein in grams per kilogram of body mass, that credible interval marginally crossed 0, which just means the uncertainty is a little higher. So, from that, we can say that there was a slightly stronger relationship between protein expressed relative to fat-free mass, right, versus expressed to body mass. So something to keep in mind. Now, to help us interpret these results further, what the Bayesian approach allows us to do is calculate probabilities, right? Which can be quite intuitive. So, for example, we can calculate the probability that all those plausible effect sizes or slope values are above 0, right? Which means are positive. And so for protein in grams per kilogram of body mass, there was a 97% probability of a positive effect. And for protein in grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, it was 99%. Okay, again, because that credible interval didn't cross the zero. So the certainty of a positive relationship was quite high based on these probabilities, but the magnitude of the effect was quite small. And it's important to understand the difference between the two. The last thing that I think we can just touch on before we maybe ask for questions is we also tried to estimate how much variance in the data was explained by protein. And this is an important point because obviously we have this median slope, we have the credible interval, right? We have some level of kind of variance, some level of uncertainty. So we were able to estimate that about 55% of the data was variation in the data was explained by protein, which
Martin, just checking, that's protein and the random effects included, right?
Okay, protein, yeah, and the random effects, correct. So that's quite a low amount, if you will. The rest of that variance likely comes from differences in training characteristics, environmental factors, etc. And in fact, we took that a step further and we estimated that about 80% of that variance is likely explained by differences in study designs. So that's an important point as well. And it's interesting because we tried to account for some factors that differ between studies, right? Those covariates I explained in the area. We tried to account for them, but they didn't seem to improve the model's fit or explanatory power. So what this kind of alludes to is that maybe the training characteristics that we really weren't able to account for, maybe they're playing a potent role in the background here. Maybe they're explaining a decent amount of that variance. We just don't know because we weren't able to explore their impact. So that's a summary of most of the kind of the primary findings that we were able to obtain from the main analysis.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic overview. Yeah, I mean, we found this relationship. It looked pretty linear. The nonlinear models we attempted, which should be able to capture some degree of diminishing returns and other sorts of nonlinear relationships, they did not fit the model, or they did not fit the data as well as this linear model did. We did test the effects of the covariates that we could meaningfully extract and quantify. We were not able to really identify any model that was meaningfully better than a very simple model that did not include those covariates. And the effect of protein was fairly small, which I know that is sometimes a tough pill to swallow or a tough powdered shake to swallow, that protein's effect actually is fairly modest. But yeah, I mean, the reality is, when you are looking at this kind of puzzle of what determines my gains or ability to keep gains, we got this big old thing that's training. We've got this big old thing that's genetics. And then we've got this little tiny thing over here, which is optimizing your protein. And then we've got, the dusting of effect size on top, which is all the other stuff we do, generalizing, overgeneralizing. But I think sometimes people get really caught up in the idea that optimizing your protein is, right up there with any other factor as the absolute biggest thing you can do. It's one of the biggest things we can do from a nutritional perspective, aside from just having appropriate energy intake. But yeah, I think you did a great job summarizing the findings. And I do have a little list of some critiques. Helms, are you comfortable moving forward?
Yeah, I'm good with that.
All right. So a couple of the easy ones I'm just going to acknowledge, and then we'll get into some of the fun ones. And Helms, help me out if I forget any, okay? Because I just kind of put a list together on the fly here. So I'm going to start with the critiques that are legit or easy to address, right? So one critique that some people have pointed out is that we looked at fat-free mass, and fat-free mass is not muscle. Correct. That is absolutely true. That's a caveat that you have to keep in mind. You will find that, to the best of my knowledge, pretty much every meta-regression on this topic has used fat-free mass or lean mass as the outcome, because the vast majority of studies are looking at whole body measures of body composition rather than extremely isolated direct muscle size findings. So that is a very legitimate caveat, but by no means a fatal flaw of the paper. People have pointed out, yes, Helms.
On that note, I think a why is probably a natural follow-up question. In sports science and exercise science that is aimed at hypertrophy, which we often consume, there's a lot of studies that will use ultrasound to assess muscle-specific hypertrophy. Very common. And that is because of logistics, design, and cost. It is much easier for a lab to obtain an ultrasound than it is to obtain a DEXA. In nutrition research, however, we're interested in body composition change. So most of the time, if you're going to have a lab that does a diet study at all, they're going to need to have some type of body composition analysis to even participate in the research. And if you have a DEXA, you are probably not going to also have the logistical feasibility, personnel, time to be able to get a measurement of the quad, the bicep,
or inclination sometimes.
Yeah. 100%, right?
Yeah.
You can have 40 people not only get ultrasound and strength testing, which you may or may not do, but you can go, you know what, we're going to put them through the DEXA and we're going to look at lean mass. And maybe if we've got, a GEI DEXA and the latest stuff, we can look at upper arm up and appendicular lean mass. But that's about as good as it gets. So if you were to say, okay, we're only going to look at direct measures of hypertrophy, now we're back to square one. We don't have enough data to even do a meta-regression in the first place.
Yeah, well, just to add on top of that, like most of these studies were actually looking at fat loss. So they did that with the DEXA, and they happened to also report fat-free mass. So without the DEXA scan, we wouldn't be able to conduct this research at all. We would have no data set like you mentioned, Eric. And just another thing to kind of piggyback on top of that as well, in practice, practitioners and athletes, they use DEXA scans pretty frequently. I know many, sports teams who might use DEXA scans pre-season, do it again 10 weeks later. They're looking at lean mass. So it's also something that people do care about, right? In the real world, despite limitations, they do care about lean mass. And, we understand that, fluid shifts can affect the results and whatnot. So we try our best to navigate that and to control it. But yes, I understand limitations, but yeah.
We did actually a sub-analysis where we specifically looked at the length of the intervention. And our model was stronger when we specifically looked at longer interventions, which gives us more confidence that those fat-free mass changes were not heavily influenced by changes in body water, but rather true tissue changes, at least in lean mass, even though we can't conclude that it was muscle.
Yeah, and you guys are stealing my thunder, because the second thing I was going to put, the second critique, was some of these studies are really short. And that's honestly, I will never fault someone for looking deep in the table and saying, hey, your inclusion criteria has some really short studies. I'm really skeptical that you're looking at true changes in muscle tissue being captured as fat-free mass here. It's a completely valid point, but that's also why we also thought of that. We agree, right? So we put in our table 2, we looked at study duration as a modifier less than 4 weeks or greater than 4 weeks. And so if you're sitting there saying, I refuse to acknowledge these studies that are less than 4 weeks long, you have the opportunity to do that. We gave you the median slope estimate and the HDI corresponding to it. And so basically what that means is if you decided you only wanted to go with the studies over 4 weeks, you as the reader are empowered to do that. But the slopes, if you just look at the studies that are greater than 4 weeks, are virtually identical to the slopes that we got in the main paper. Martin, correct me if I'm wrong. The slopes that we got here when we scaled to fat-free mass and when we scaled to total body mass, I think both of them were in the 0.06, 0.07 ballpark. Is that right for the overall slopes?
Yes. Yeah, 0.06, 0.07. Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you want to look only at the studies greater than 4 weeks, the slopes are 0.07 and 0.07. So basically, the critique is valid in terms of the plausibility behind it, but in terms of the overall effect estimate, has absolutely no impact. But it's totally fair to point that out, and that's exactly why we certainly looked into that and reported it in the paper. Now, one of the other things that's kind of quick to address, and Martin, you already basically touched on this previously, but a lot of people kind of saw it and said, well, the main models you're presenting are not accounting for this covariate, that covariate, the other covariate. And it seemed like there was a general desire for us to basically say, we're going to look at the effect of protein after controlling for body fat percentage, sex, duration, basically every single covariate that we could possibly quantify and jam into the model. And Martin, I think you did a great job, explaining or at least mentioning the idea that, when we're talking about these covariates, first of all, we want to have the most parsimonious model, which means if we can get as good a model without having all these caveats, then we want to. We want to be able to say, here is the result of our finding, rather than saying, to figure out how much protein you might consider eating, here is this massive calculator online that we had to create to account for all these different variables in what you're doing, right? Like there's very clear utility in saying, if we don't have to make this more complicated, and it is statistically not advised to make this more complicated, we should err toward the less complicated model. Now, one thing I want to add to that, Martin, is if you decide in a meta-regression because some people are going to hear that and say, still, I wish you corrected for it because I just feel better about that intuitively. If you have a meta-regression that does not have a super large number of studies, and ours did not by a long shot, okay? So you've got this relatively small body of literature, and you decide that you're going to put in a ton of different covariates, some of which may be correlated with one another, and some of which may be non-significant, and some of which may show the opposite directionality of what you anticipated just because weird stuff happens when you have small numbers of studies. But when you start jamming all these covariates into a model, especially when there's a small number of studies in the model, what you get is unstable parameter estimates for each one of those covariates. There is a risk that trying to control for a thing could actually backfire and give you a parameter estimate for that variable that makes absolutely no sense at the population level. Mm-hmm. And so, again, you run into this risk. You mentioned the risk of overfitting. You run into this risk where you start jamming in all these predictors with relatively unstable point estimates that may not actually reflect the population level effect. And by the time you actually get down to the variable you wish to interpret, it's this giant stew of fairly unpredictable estimates with a ton of volatility. And it may ultimately end up in a model that is demonstrably worse than if you simply did not put all that stuff in. And Martin, if you have anything you want to add to that, of course, please feel free.
Yeah, so just briefly, it's not that we didn't do that. We kind of did, at least with the 4 covariates that I outlined earlier. And if you want to look at how that worked out, you can in the supplementary file. So we have multiple kind of sub-models there that showcase the relationships with the covariates, and they all look pretty similar. They all have, from a kind of just a brief overview of them, a brief visual inspection, they all have that linear pattern. So pretty similar responses. Another thing to consider is at the end of the day, the difference, for example, between the model fit for like the quadratic model, which is one of our non-linear models, and the linear model, the difference wasn't that large between the two. So sometimes like you can kind of use your expertise to make calls about them as well. So I'm not saying it's not that our linear model is like, that's exactly how this relationship looks. It's, there is a possibility for some curvature in that line. It's just, we decided to go with, best model fit, least complexity. And that's what we presented in the main paper. At the end of the day, that wouldn't really change. Based on what I'm seeing here, it wouldn't really change how we kind of write about these effects and how we discuss them.
And if I may, Trex, I think a really simple way of explaining variance between covariates and how that can create some of those non-intuitive impacts on the model is if you think about if we looked at a health metric in the population, and in our model we controlled for BMI, height, weight, sex, and body composition, right? Immediately, you're probably thinking, hold on, the taller someone is, probably the more they weigh. Height and weight is accounted for in BMI, and BMI is positively correlated with body fat percentage, and women have a higher body fat percentage at baseline because of higher central fat than men. And imagine then that we use those covariates and we wanted to know the relationship between some type of health marker and nutrition. Those things you could immediately see, well, hold on, like there might be independent effects of sex or body mass or various factors we're looking at that could have different directions, even though they're related to one another. And all of a sudden now, by trying to control for and account for a variable, you're washing away the independent effects of other variables, and you get gobbledygook. So there is a real risk by, even though it makes sense from a logical perspective, because our brains are thinking of the independent effect of the thing on the outcome, and not of all the correlatory effects that we can't necessarily account for statistically that we know exist, are going to essentially muddy the waters and make it harder to find that signal in the noise.
Yeah, and I am hereby insisting, demanding that we, including me, stop using the term controlling for when we talk about adding covariates to a model, because I do think it fundamentally misrepresents what is happening, and it gives people way too much confidence in like, oh, and then we'll just control for everything. It's like, if you were really controlling for everything you added as a covariate, it would be so indefensible to ever run an experiment. Why would we ever do such a ridiculous thing, right? Like, what? Why go through the trouble? Just control with it, control it statistically and we'll be okay. So instead, I insist that everyone says, we are going to partial out the independent variance shared between this predictor and the outcome variable. All right?
Trex, can you say that again so people can write it down?
Yeah, I forgot.
It's recorded. We can back it up.
Okay.
Okay, so moving on to another thing. This is one that got a lot of attention. So folks, and Martin, I think you addressed this adequately without question, but nonetheless, some folks asked, you guys basically suggested that the preferred model, not using that exact terminology though, was basically, it looks like it kind of makes sense to scale protein recommendations by fat-free mass rather than total mass. Now, Martin, you mentioned the kind of statistical defense, which is twofold, right? So one of the reasons that we really kind of highlighted the model that's scaled to fat-free mass is because, that was a slope in which the HDI did not actually cover zero. That whole HDI range was in the positive territory. And in addition, the width of that interval was more narrow, which would suggest that we had a more precise estimate of the slope. And ultimately, when you're doing this type of meta-regression, getting a precise effect estimate of that slope between protein intake and fat-free mass retention, that is really a key goal of this project, is to estimate that slope with precision. Statistically, I think you covered that really well. And even getting beyond the statistics, because honestly, stats are dumb. Statistics lie. We all know it. Helms, global warming, etc. But when you look at just the logic behind it, right? So when people ask me why I favor, because I have favored for a while scaling by fat-free mass. When people ask me why, I often just, let's say hypothetically you woke up tomorrow and you had 40 more pounds of fat than you went to bed with. First of all, you got to talk to a doctor because that is highly unusual. But nonetheless, you wake up 40 pounds heavier and you somehow know this is pure fat. How much do you really believe your protein needs have gone up physiologically? Most people would probably say something that's either none or close to none, right? Because we're not having really higher rates of protein turnover just because your adipocytes are more full of lipid. So I think that you could, Martin, you made the statistical argument, which is defensible. Of course, people could push back against it and say, no, you've added all this complexity by scaling to fat-free mass, which I disagree with. But, people could push back and say, keep it simple and go by body mass. But, like I said, I don't think from a mechanistic kind of rationale, people really believe that to be true. I think it's just convenient. And I also will note that the people who tend to point that out and say, just do it by body weight, don't do it by fat-free mass, and this is not a knock on them, but almost all of their work, almost all of their clients, and almost all of their content is targeted toward a body fat range that is this wide. It's basically people who their entire target market in terms of clientele, content, etc., is people whose body fat is between 13 and 19% body fat. So yeah, if you're working with a group that is this homogeneous in terms of their body composition characteristics, then there will be no difference, right? But if you really want to make a protein recommendation that scales to the 330-pound super heavyweight powerlifter and also scales to the 106-pound bikini competitor, I think it becomes pretty indefensible to say that we should be going with body weight over fat-free mass when you're seeing body fat ranges that scale from, you're trying to relate this to a natural bodybuilder who's 140 pounds at 5% body fat and the super heavyweight powerlifter who's 330 pounds at 38% body fat. Things get really out of whack when you start to generalize those protein recommendations to the extremes of even what we see in the fitness world, let alone outside of the fitness world. Helms, tell me I'm wrong.
You're not wrong. I'd love to tell you you're wrong. I love to tell you you're wrong, just as a general statement of things I like in the world. I don't get the opportunity to do it very often, at least not truthfully. So unfortunately, this is one of those times where I am missing out on that fun stuff. And to add a bit more perspective on this, ultimately, like there is some protein in adipose tissue, but the protein turnover, like you said, that's something we need to consider. And that's actually the same critique that comes from, hold on, how do we know lean mass is fat-free mass? And I think there is something to be said for the fact that people do lose lean mass more predictably than muscle mass, at least where we measure it, when they diet. And I still think that's something you want to prevent, because I can't think of many places that aren't muscle tissue where I'd actually want to lose lean mass during a diet anyway. I do think probably a lot of it has to do with like GI tract atrophy because you're moving less stuff through.
Yeah.
But it could also very plausibly, seeing some of the relationships we see with lean mass changes and hyperphagia and weight reshooting, maybe having a higher protein intake while dieting prevents your liver from shrinking too much, or things like that. That is not implausible. And that does explain some portion of a metabolic adaptation, not all of it, but we've talked about that previously. So I think it makes a ton of sense. And I think it also gives more tools to people, right? So if you are trying to prescribe, let's say, there's a lot of people who work with people with obesity who might read this paper and go like, they're in an energy deficit, they're resistance training, they're very serious about it. And my God, this person weighs 130 kilos. I don't feel responsible giving them even the mid-range of this protein recommendation based upon, lean body mass. But if you use our fat-free mass, all of a sudden it might be 2/3 of that, which makes a lot more sense. And it's much more, plausible. And I think obviously this will be attached later. There's a difference between what we recommend and the relationship we observed. And there's a stark difference, actually.
Yeah,
which we'll talk about.
Yeah, we will definitely get into that. There's one more critique I want to get into, and then I want to talk about how our findings ought to be interpreted, how we interpret them. And frankly, I also want to mention whether or not that supports the biases I came into the project with. But the last thing I want to talk about is a lot of people said, you idiots, why is there not a cut point analysis? So, and basically what they're saying is, we read the Morton paper from 2018. It was a meta-regression. The line went up and then the line became flat. And a lot of people are saying, we know to be true that the line must become flat, and you forgot to draw the flat part. And I think before we talk about anything more detailed, it's worth going back to that Morton paper, because I do believe some of the best researchers in our field were part of that Morton paper.
You're obligated to say that since I was an author.
Absolutely. I think it has a high level of utility, but I will not stand by and say that if your stats don't match specifically that one figure from the Morton paper, you did them wrong. Okay? Because here's the straight shot about that figure that gave us the 1.6 to 2.2 and has become kind of etched into everyone's minds. First of all, I don't believe that figure accounted for double counting of effect sizes that came from the same studies. Generally speaking, when you have correlated data points within the same plot, you want to make sure you account for that, usually with random effects. In addition, I don't believe that the data points were weighted relative to their inverse variance or sample size. Generally speaking, in a meta-regression, you would like to do that. And then finally, why did the line become flat at the end? Because the procedure insisted upon it. Okay, like they didn't just say, let's calculate any two lines that best fit this data and see if the second one is flat. The second line in that breakpoint analysis was set to a slope of 0, predetermined, not because the data insisted upon it. And the location of the breakpoint that was found was 1.6 grams per kilogram, and the confidence interval
1.62 trucks.
1.62 grams per kilogram, and the confidence interval basically spanned the entire width of the entire data set. So basically, the way to interpret that confidence interval is this number that we're predicting, our estimate of this breakpoint is at 1.6, and we feel pretty confident that it's somewhere between the smallest values in this data set and the largest values in this data set. In other words, there was virtually no precision to speak of with regards to where that cut point actually is located. And I should finally mention, the breakpoint analysis was not statistically significant. So if you were playing the stats by the book and you did that breakpoint analysis, you would say the breakpoint is not significant, therefore we'll just do a linear fit instead. Okay, so because of those reasons, as a person who enjoys stats more than would be indicated or appropriate, it gets under my skin a little bit to say, well, that's the gold standard of how we're doing stats now, and if you do anything different, you're wrong. Because everything that I just mentioned in there is an extremely valid critique and something that if those very same researchers did the analysis again today, I don't believe they would do them, especially when it comes to not weighting the data points, not accounting for, correlated observations. Some of those are, you got to do them by just the way the field has changed since 2018. So that's not a knock on them. I think the paper yielded some really, really helpful conclusions and was well done. But those are real things to consider. Helms, you look like you're about to defend yourself and yell at me.
Well, no. I think you really accurately portrayed it. And because I am one of the authors on that paper, I think I can provide some behind the scenes perspective. And also just to speak to it directly, Menno Henselman was as well. And he's one of the people these are basically many of his critiques. There was not universal agreement on the way to position, and there never is, and there shouldn't be in science, which is great. There was not universal consensus on how to present or describe or discuss the data and interpret it and write about it in the Morton paper. Studies don't expire. I've said this before. Meta-analyses do, because as more studies comes out, we can get a more precise estimate. So while meta-analyses are the gold standard when they're done right, and the best information we have in our small sample size plagued fields of sports nutrition as well as sports science, we need to be using the most updated one, which I'll piggyback off of my own comment in a second. So in Morton, we did see, hey, here is the breakpoint analysis. I think it was like a p equals 0.074 or something like that. It was a lowish p-value, and we were semi-comfortable with that, but we wanted to be able to give more reasonable prescriptive outcomes. We wanted to give people something they could use. And if we said, hey, we think you should consume somewhere between 1 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein, people would not be very happy with us.
Yeah,
and also
exactly.
Probably wouldn't give the best estimate of what's likely true. So we had a reasonably low p-value, and we said, you know what? So what if there's no real downside that we can measure besides, the opportunity cost, the time, the effort, maybe the actual financial cost of consuming a higher protein diet. So what if we went with the upper half of this confidence interval as a way, it's starting at the breakpoint, of course, which is the middle point value, to give people a better safe than sorry recommendation. And we explicitly stated that's why we did it. And we reported that absolute p-value, right?
Yeah.
So
definitely. If you guys wanted to, not that anyone on that paper would, but it would have been very, very easy to conceal some of these elements that are being critiqued in ways that would not jump off the pages like fraudulent. So that paper was transparently reported without any question, but go on.
Yeah. And so not everyone was on the same page with that. We got to a point where we were all comfortable with it. And the recommendation in the text versus the abstract was slightly different because we wanted to be very specific. Like, hey, if maximizing any chance that muscle mass is your goal, here's the recommended range we need. Oh, and by the way, we need more research. Now, the beautiful thing about research, like I said, is we do have more research now and better ways of looking at where there might be a bend or a breakpoint in the data. Tagawa did this in 2020. And that was, there's been a fight between Menno and Milo Wolf about that one. But, and I think the main critique was, hey, this didn't account for the fact that there's some data using deficits in this, and we can't look at this. So well, actually, they used body weight as a covariate. One thing I liked about Tagawa is they used similar nonlinear models that we did, and they found that the slope became much flatter after the 1.3 grams per kilogram range. So they did sort of find I wouldn't say a breakpoint where it goes flat, but diminishing returns after 1.3 grams per kilogram of protein intakes. And then the same lab, Stu Phillips' lab, in 2022, Nunes and colleagues did a arguably more up-to-date and maybe better analysis, including not only a linear meta-regression, but also a categorical comparison, which I think we should talk about why we didn't do a categorical comparison and the potential weakness of that statistically. But they found that yes, while over 1.6 categorically had a higher effect size than compared to 1.2 to 1.59, it would have been less than a small effect size between them, like our data, and it was still positive right around that point where Tagawa started to see that break point. So to go back to our own effect size, and this is really important, 0.06 or 0.07, depending upon which model you favor, for 1 gram per kilogram of protein intakes means that you have to go all the way from 1 to 3 before you're getting close to what we would describe as a trivial to small effect size. So that cannot be contextualized enough. And just because we did not necessarily observe a similar diminishing returns relationship that was observed by Tagawa, or the arguably defensible breakpoint analysis that is, I would say, expired now from 2018, it doesn't mean that in future analyses where we have more data, one could emerge or diminishing returns relationship could provide a better model fit than ours. But I actually put, and I don't know if you guys remember this, I basically said that in our discussion, and you guys went, Helms, that could be true, but you're actually being probably too generous because we're just not observing that at all in our data. And we don't want to give people a false impression that, hey, there is a breakpoint somewhere out there. We have no evidence to believe it's the case, but we're going to say it probably exists based upon other studies.
Yeah.
Right? So I got countermanded. I was the guy with the protein bias who wrote the original study, who said maybe we should say that there could be a breakpoint or a diminishing returns relationship like has been observed in these two other metas, Tagawa and Morton, but we just don't have enough data on high protein. And you guys said, listen, that's not what the data show. We got to be honest about this. And now we're getting flack online.
Yeah, I mean, and if I could chime in on that, so the thing about biases is that we all make more content than anyone actually wants to listen to. And so we've all made claims about stuff, and it's on the permanent record, right? So you can absolutely go back to old podcasts where I say, listen, folks, come on. If you're getting at least 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, you're getting plenty of protein. If you really feel nervous about it, 1.4 seems like plenty for a lot of folks. If anything, I have been more an outlier on the low protein recommendation, and just in terms of being pragmatic, being practical, are you getting the lion's share of gains, right? And so I've always been of the kind of public, proclamation, so to speak. I've always put it out there saying you're getting the lion's share of the benefits at numbers that are even probably below 1.6 grams per kilogram, depending on your body fat level. And so that kind of implies not only diminishing returns, but that they diminish a lot earlier than people might think. Okay. And so if I were in the group on that Morton paper, which criminally I wasn't, I would have been the annoying guy who gave everyone headaches, much like I was to you, Helms, because my approach when I'm doing science is I am going to use prior knowledge when it comes to defining the research question and defining the methods and planning the project. But once it's in motion and we have the data, I will only speak to what the data indicate. I'm not going to say well, we did this meta-regression and we planned it in a way that we thought was sensible, but I just decided I don't believe the data. So we'll say that there's a breakpoint in there where there isn't. There's a level of humility. This is coming from the guy who, if you talked to me in 2013, I would have told you all about how you can, I never got this hyperbolic. I was very optimistic about things like reverse dieting and diet breaks as like meaningfully, just absolutely like making huge impacts on metabolic adaptation. I did research in those areas. We found nothing. I don't think the book on that's fully closed, but when I write the articles, I say, hey, guess what? We found a whole bunch of nothing. This didn't seem to help at all, right? So I think it's really important that, like, I'm not saying we need to write up these papers as if we have no knowledge of the literature, but at the same time, when you use that knowledge of the literature to plan out a project and execute it in the way you planned, and the data don't support the bias you came into it with, I think you do have, I think you have to be very wary about extending excessively generous olive branches to the hypotheses that other people value if they're not in the data. I mean, you can reference other data and say, hey, our data don't match this, which seemed to show, in this study that there was this plateau or diminishing returns, whatever the case may be. And I should mention, when we talk about diminishing returns, it may not necessarily be a flat line. It could go from a steep slope to a shallow slope, and we might need to determine what those two are. I'm not saying that in our data. I'm just saying if we zoom out and say, what is the true honest-to-God relationship between these variables after you account for every resistance training variable that could possibly be accounted for and have this massive data set with perfect levels of detail, it could be a number of different relationships in there. But at the end of the day, we had the data we had, and I am, for one, quite proud of the fact that we left our biases at the door, got into the room to write it up, and then gave what I believe to be pretty sensible recommendations. How do you feel about that, Martin?
Yeah, well, I think there's a bit of a lesson here. So I was reading this text the other day. I'm sure you guys can see. There's the breakpoint analysis. This is a 2024 textbook. So you read through this text, and it almost comes across as irrefutable knowledge. And so to me, it seems as if that kind of idea that, this breakpoint exists has kind of become like a dogma over the years. And it still serves, obviously, lots of utility. But basically, when something does become dogma, we have this desire to stop questioning it because we just roll with it. And this is a lesson I've learned over the past few months. So I realized that I'd never questioned that data set. I don't think I'd even read the paper completely because it was everywhere. I'd read a textbook, from years ago, and it would be confirmed. It would be there. Now, there's no mention of uncertainty in this text. So I guess what we want to do is try to resist that desire to stop questioning information, even when things start to, become quite certain, right? Or like as has been in this case over the past years. When people are talking about a certain idea and it seems to be pretty well established, continue to question it, continue to critique it, continue to explore it in science. And I guess that's what we're all kind of trying to be a part of here. So I thought I'd just mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? It's entirely possible that, over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot of studies fill in those higher ranges of our data set, in the, above the 2.5, 3 grams per kilogram, getting into the higher ranges. And maybe as more density of data fills in that upper range, maybe we do see a breakpoint that becomes flat. Or maybe it becomes more shallow, or maybe it's logarithmic. But when you start baking those conclusions into your papers that provide no evidence of them, I mean, who's to say that at 5 grams per kilogram, we don't run into a vertical line of infinite gains? Well, I don't think that's true, and our data don't say it, but like our data support that as much as they support pretty much a breakpoint being in it. So you have to really be careful about saying like, well, if we talk about everything that could theoretically be true if the literature were different, the point of the paper is to summarize the literature that are, not the literature that could be, right? So now I think it's probably a good time to cut straight to the conclusion here and talk a little bit about the recommendations we gave. And this is kind of another critique is I think a lot of people who did not read the recommendations took a lot of issue with our recommendations. And that's like, I'm not being snarky, but I do believe that to be the case because a lot of people kind of saw the main figure from the paper and said, so you mean to tell me I should eat always more protein infinite protein, more and more and more always to be better and better. And I don't believe at all that that's the kind of conclusion we reached in the paper. I don't believe that's how we framed it, because when we discussed the conclusion, we talked first of all about the small effect size. We talked about the cost of macros are a zero-sum game. If you have a calorie allotment and you're going more on one thing, you're going less on something else. And all the macros have an important role to play in the party here. Martin Helms, why don't you talk a little bit, because you're our practical application guru here. Martin did such a fantastic job talking through the methods, the results, the statistics. So why don't you kind of summarize how we framed the kind of key takeaways, what people ought to do with this, and maybe people will stop sending us all of these hateful messages and threatening letters.
Absolutely. So as you guys can clearly see in this super well presented, high def, no, there we go. See, now I've used this high tech method of blocking the glare. What we did is we stratified our protein intakes into up to the point where there was a zero line, the slope hit zero on changes in fat-free mass. So the retention on average of fat-free mass, protein intakes for people with a low risk of losing lean mass, which we operationally discussed based upon some of our covariate analyses. You're relatively high in body fat. You're not having a high degree of a deficit. You're not dieting for a really long time. And also a low importance. I'm not super concerned about maintaining every single ounce of lean mass. I'm primarily concerned with improving my health, making weight, but I'm not a strength athlete. Maybe I'm a lightweight rower or something like that, because this isn't the strength conditioning journal, importantly. This isn't the journal of obesity, right? And you know what? Considering the small effect size, I'm okay with a little bit of lean mass, which may or may not even be muscle. And I'm a college student. I don't have a ton of money. Maybe I'm vegan and it's challenging to get in that amount of protein. So we said, hey, try to get to that point where you're not losing any lean mass, because it's only going to be helpful. But if it's not a big deal to lose a little bit of lean mass, then don't stress it, because we're talking about very marginally small effects here. And then if you're in that moderate category, where either you have a high risk of losing lean mass, which you want to prevent, or the risk isn't that high, but you have a high degree of importance to maintaining it. So, for example, let's say you're a super heavyweight power lifter and you're like, you know what, I'm actually at the point where my deadlift is getting to be a problem. I would like to drop from 180 kilos to 170, see if I can maintain my bench strength and my squat strength, but I do want to have an easier time navigating my body. My belt's not fitting right. This is totally something understandable. Or I'm a sumo wrestler or a wrestler in the heavyweight category, and I've been told I'm not really fast, but I need to maintain my power. You're probably not going to lose a lot of lean mass when you're in that high of a body fat, but you don't want to lose any. So, okay, now we're suggesting you should at least be hitting that point where we're on average not seeing a loss of lean mass. And then if you can get more than that, hey, extra credit, but really don't worry about it, because we're talking about a very small effect size. And then there's I have a high risk and a high importance. Now we're talking about, say, a drug-free bodybuilder or a lightweight power lifter who is cutting down even leaner. We're talking about Kel Beckland trying to drop from 74 kilos to 66, or the last 6 weeks of your bodybuilding show, when you're trying to go from 7% body fat to 6 or 5% body fat and minimize the chance of lean mass losses when the risk is high and you're going to get on stage naked in front of everybody flexing. So now we did not tell people to consume the highest point in our data set. We told them to consume the range. And importantly, we didn't say, hey, 1.9 to 3.2, but by the way, 3.2 is better. Because we're talking about effect sizes here. The range from 1.2 to 3.2 is only 1.3. So if you do 1.3 times 0.07, we're getting close to a 0.1 effect size, which is close to half of a small effect size. And if you use the fat-free mass range, which is a little broader because we had a fair amount of heterogeneity in the body composition, and there would have been more if we hadn't actually had a cap on the body fat percentage that was in the inclusion criteria. Now we're going from 2.5 to 4.2. So it's 1.7. So now, and that has a slightly lower effect size, by the way. So now we're talking about almost a small effect size to go from the bottom of our highest range to the top. And I had a practical question. The first question that pops up was, Helms, are you up to the challenge of consuming 3.2 grams per kilograms of body mass per day And they described me as a 90 kilogram male. I'm currently at 88, and my stage weight is actually closer to 80. And we don't have any guidance on whether I should use the body weight I'm getting to, or if I use my fat-free mass, but the number that I would probably be at would be in the high 200s if I decided to eat the highest amount. But that's not a day-to-day effect size, you know? So what I do in my practice is I basically would be using the higher range, and I'd also simplify it. Because why 1.3.2? That's just annoying. How about 2 to 3? So the recommendation I would give to somebody would be, 2.5 to 4 if we're going by fat-free mass, or 2 to 3 if we're going by total mass. I would probably use the 2.5 to 4 for fat-free mass for me. So that would mean on a day-to-day basis, considering that it's less than a trivial effect size for the difference between the top and bottom for that, what would I do in my prep and know that it would have literally no measurable difference on an individual level? I would be somewhere in the range, considering I have about 74, 75-ish kilos to make the mass easier. I'd be at least 225 grams of protein per day and maybe up to as much as 275 to 280. That would be my goal, right? Am I up to the challenge? Hint, I've done that for many, many years. It's a little bit higher than I've had in recent years because I've actually backed off as the data has not really shown convincingly until now that maybe there's a benefit to higher protein intakes. And the last thing I will say about that is I think this is really interesting. The ability to use larger data sets is fundamentally changing our ability to give more precise estimates that aren't maybe as useful as people used to think they are. So we can tell you with reasonable confidence that 30 sets at the population level will probably produce more hypertrophy in a 2 to 3 month period versus 15 sets. However, we don't think that's a good idea. And people are starting to come around to that idea after Zach and Josh and the crew at Data Driven Strength banging this drum over and over that, hey, just because we observe this relationship of higher volumes with greater hypertrophy doesn't mean that you tomorrow and forever should always do 30 sets. We understand that, until it starts to work against you, you should probably try to increase your volume, but only in that case, and then scale it to whatever your individual slope might be. The same thing is true of protein. Yeah, it might make sense to try to get up to 3 or 4 if you're going by fat-free mass. If you really are trying to maximize everything, understanding that we're talking about grams of tissue over the course of months when you're in the same range. If you're trying to have grams of tissue be visible to bodybuilding judges. But there are no studies to my knowledge which have a significant effect favoring higher protein intakes in a deficit in the ranges that we're talking about. And we can only see the signal in the noise when we have these big data sets. And the reason for that is because of sampling variance and small effects. So we have low-powered, small number of studies and something that is only going to produce a small effect size at best anyway. And if we were to predict what would we see, if we were to model this data, let's say we had a data set that we knew had a trivial to small effect size in 10,000 people, and we were to do random sampling from it with small sample sizes, arguably indefensibly small, probably shouldn't publish this, we would get several studies that indicated a lower protein intake was better than a higher protein intake. A ton of studies that showed there was no significant difference. Some studies, eventually, that would show a significant difference favoring higher protein. And unfortunately, some of those studies would overrepresent the effect, and others would represent it accurately, and some would undercook it. And that's basically what we see. I'm aware of, in fact, you can look at the distribution, right here. I'm going to do another amazing figure. You can see that once we get to around that, say, 3 gram line, we get more clustering of dots over the regression line. But oh my God, what is this one right here? What is happening? Who is this errant one? Isn't that the breakpoint, folks? Look at it's below the line. Well, that's the thing, is we can't just look at dots and a line and get an estimate of this. This goes back to what Trexler said about what is the weighting of the study and why are those dots different sizes? It's meant to represent their overall effect or how much they pull on the line, their effect on the model. And if you're just looking at this as study groups in a line and thinking, I should draw the line in the way that fits those dots, I think a better way to think of it is, what if I could see the N, the population in each one of those dots? And what if that dot that's below the line was N of 8, and the dot that's above it, in the same spot for the same protein intake, was N of 50? That is why we can't just look at lines in a dot and have an idea of what the breakpoint is. You have to actually understand, at least like I do, to a conceptual level, not an operational level, the statistical concepts so that you can communicate it effectively and understand what you're actually looking at. So I know that was a long rant, Trex. It's probably more than you even asked for, but I think the big take-home points are that there is such a small effect size here within the ranges that we're talking about that we provided recommendations that span from 1.9 all the way up to 3.2, but we did not say in a practical sense that it was better to be at 3.2 than say 1.9. And we allowed for the reader to interpret the risk and importance of what they cared about to then decide for themselves. And then we clearly stated the limitations. So we observed a relationship, but we recommended something that probably made sense in the real world to the best of our capability.
Yeah, absolutely. Martin, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly. So it's interesting because I think most people know that the answer to basically everything training and nutrition related is it depends, or at least when you speak to someone one-on-one and you ask them a question, they're usually going to say it depends before they kind of move on and clarify that. But for some reason, when new research comes out, some people are often disappointed that there's no one given answer, and they forget that it actually all depends. And what we try to do with our practical recommendations is kind of inject that thought process into them. That's why we have a table. That's why we have a practical recommendation section. We can't distill it all into one sentence. And at the end of the day, you know, as a practitioner, you kind of have to put pieces of a puzzle together yourself too. So we're giving you some of those pieces. We're saying that, hey, maybe you should consider the perceived risk of muscle loss. But we're not telling you how much weight to put into someone's body fat levels or calorie deficit size, or whether they're males or females, or the whole host of other factors that you might think influence perceived risk of muscle loss. It's on you to weigh those factors and consider that for your individual client. And same goes for the importance of muscle mass retention. It's up to you to put some of those pieces together and then use our ranges as just starting points, right? You can start high and then maybe give yourself some reasons as to why you shouldn't stick to that really high intake. Maybe you want some more room for carbohydrate in your calorie allocation. Maybe you need more dietary fats for a certain reason, right? And you can give yourself reasons to kind of cut back at that. And as long as you're somewhere within that range that we've prescribed for your risk and your importance, that's probably a big thumbs up. But again, that how I go about doing that is going to look a little different to how Eric might go about doing that with his clients. At the end of the day, we're all going to have, you know, our own individual preferences, and I might think that a certain factor is going to influence, you know, muscle loss a bit more than another one. And, you know, as long as we can kind of defend that, and as long as collectively we can try and get ourselves closer to, you know, the best way of doing things, you know, that's what we should all be kind of aiming for. So science isn't, you know, designed to give us answers in isolation. We kind of need to use our own brains. We need to use, you know, the philosophy of science, if you will, to get there ourselves, right? Or as a collective. And that's why we provided the ranges. We've come up with a table that I don't often see when I read through research papers. It's usually just the conclusion, maybe a small practical application section, and it's kind of left there. So we've tried to kind of start the thought process for you as a practitioner or a trainee. But yeah, unfortunately, we just can't give you the answers based on our analysis.
We could, but we won't, because then it's harder for Helms to sell his books.
That's right, which is the real reason we do everything.
Yep.
Right. In fact, I actually would prefer if everyone would go back to 2018 and stop publishing, because that's when my second edition came out. And the whole reason I have to write this third edition is because jerks like Data-Driven Strength keep changing the numbers I have to report. So science is not on my side for book editions. I want to throw you two guys a curveball, though, before we stop on this, because you're the statisticians. One of the critiques that I saw was, why didn't you guys, say, like Nunez or many other papers, do different categorical ranges of protein and compare them? Wouldn't it have been at least more informative to, say, have a quartiles for the ranges we have? Wouldn't that be an improvement, and tell us which one's better than the other? And then we could have these straight up comparisons. Which range is best? Boom.
Martin, may I take this one? Do you mind?
Yeah, I think you left a comment on Instagram, so
Well, I left a lot of comments to a lot of people. Believe me. I'm just kidding. I was relatively nice to everyone. Yeah. So here's the challenge is like, there are different types of data, right? And in this case, you could talk about continuous data versus categorical data. So when you have, continuous data like we have where, protein intake level per day could be 1.26 grams per kilogram. It could be 1.71. It could be 1.99. It could be 3.12. It could take any value between the minimum and the maximum range. And there will be a corresponding effect size for each data point, which similarly is continuous. It can take any value between the smallest and the largest of the values we observed. That is the most granular form of data we can have. It provides the most bits of information relative to any way we could chop that data up. And so while it is often seen and often done, the idea of putting those data into categorical bins and then comparing the bins, the problem is, for example, let's say you make a bin that goes from 1.2 to 1.5999 repeating grams per kilogram. And then the next bin is from 1.6 up to, let's say, 1.99999. So what you're telling me is when you're comparing those bins, that the number 1.21 and 1.58 are more similar than the numbers 1.59 and 1.61. That's what you're telling me when you say all the data points between 1.2 and 1.59, we're going to lump those together and say that's all the same thing. And then everything between 1.6 and 1.99, that's all the same thing. So you run into scenarios where not only have you taken a lot of data and making it less data, you have also taken numbers that are far apart and called them the same, and taken numbers that are very close together and called them dramatically different in the way you've set up that analysis. So I'm not going to say there's never a time to do that. Regrettably, I have done that in my life. Sometimes it is advisable to do that for a variety of good defensible reasons. But in terms of taking our main analysis and chopping it up into categories like that, it would have resulted in a lower powered analysis with less informative data. Now, it may have led us to a conclusion that people preferred, but that's never a good reason to go about chopping up your data that way. And if you have rich continuous data, generally speaking, you want to leave it that way. The one place where it gets a little trickier is sometimes there are reasons why, for example, if you're doing a meta-regression and you're just trying to break it down into simple moderator comparisons of, looking at this versus that, for a variety of reasons, sometimes it does make sense to bin things. But when you're talking about your main predictor and your main outcome, I am generally averse to the idea. Martin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I might just briefly touch on the secondary analyses because we didn't.
Sure. Yeah.
We didn't really outline kind of the idea behind that, but it's very similar in the sense that we had these covariates, and to explore the influence of the covariates further, we had to also categorize them. And it's difficult to do because there's no specific rules that we can exactly follow. There's guidelines, and basically we categorize these covariates into subgroups based on the distribution of their data and our domain-specific expertise. So, for example, just a quick example with intervention duration, we seem to think, based on some research, practical experience, that under 4 weeks, an intervention duration of that length is going to be quite susceptible to fluid shifts, which could influence fat-free mass change. So we kind of used the 4-week mark as the cutoff. For participant sex, that was an easy one, male versus female. And then for body fat levels, that was an interesting one. So again, this required a lot of thinking. It was difficult to do this. So we had to, for males, what we did is we separated the body fat levels into quartiles. We combined the second and third quartiles together to give us low, medium, and high categories. Then we added 8% to those numbers to create categories for females. Because on average, based on some research that we've read, again, and what we think, what we've seen, on average, females may have, 8% more body fat than males, right? And again, these things aren't concrete, but to allow us to explore the covariates, we have to make some assumptions. We have to make these decisions to get us there. And unfortunately, doing so, like Trexler said, reduces the power of each of the subgroups. The number of observations we have in each subgroup is now lower. We've also added that into the table 2, for you guys to see the number of observations per subgroup, because when we're looking at these secondary analyses, we can't just look at the numbers that kind of show up in the table. We have to consider, well, what was our confidence going into the categorization of those subgroups in the first place? Because I'm more confident about some than others, right? And what were the number of observations in each of the subgroups? Some are higher than others, and we have to kind of give some stock into that when we're interpreting the secondary analyses. And so I thought I'd just kind of bring that up because it feeds into this idea of categorizing variables, and hopefully kind of makes sense for people to understand, well, those are all the steps they had to put into place to make these decisions. It's a lot, it's difficult, and we just hope that this can kind of set up, hopefully this can provide some food for thought for practitioners, right? And set up future research.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm sure some people at home are thinking like, well, you just said don't categorize, and then you just talked about your moderator test, which did categorize some continuous variables. That is largely, it has some things to do with statistical power, but also largely has to do with just simply interpretation. So for example, when we're leaving the main variables, the predictor and the outcome as continuous, our result is a slope, right? That's really what we're looking at. What is the slope between protein intake and fat-free mass retention? So then when you say, well, now we want to look at, does it matter if it was for, if we're looking at leaner people or less lean people, higher or lower body fat, or if we're looking at, time, shorter studies versus longer studies. It's much, much more intuitive and interpretable to say, the slope was this much in short studies and this much in long studies than it is to say, well, crap, we found a interaction between these slopes, and now to interpret that in a meaningful way, we are going to give you a value to interpret at the lower end of this relationship and one at the median area of this relationship and one of the high, because now we have 2 different slopes that are going in different directions. They're non-parallel. For interpretation purposes, when you're doing specifically those moderator tests, it is a lot more defensible to start binning things up just for those kind of quick comparisons of leaner versus heavier, shorter versus longer, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And an easy way to think of those is they're almost meta-regressions within the meta-regression. So it's basically saying, hey, if we changed our inclusion criteria and we ran a meta-regression on only the studies that were over 4 weeks, then it's not necessarily just a categorical comparison, but we're going, all right, what if we change the rules?
Yeah. What if we only do this in males? What if we only do it in females? Yeah.
Because to some degree, it is arbitrary what our inclusion criteria is. It's not arbitrary, but it's related to a research question, which we had to qualitatively define.
It's arguable. Yeah.
It's arguable. Well said. So what if we'd said, no, we only want to look at over 4 weeks, or only want to look at under 4 weeks, or we only want to look at the leanest people? The cost of that is we're looking at far fewer studies.
Mm-hmm.
And this means that we're making these judgment calls, which are transparent, but we're also then having to make some concession on the statistics to make that judgment call. And it may or may not be worth it. And that's why we don't emphasize the sub-analyses quite as much. And I think a great example is the deficit size.
Mm-hmm.
2021, great meta-regression by Kohler and Murphy, or Murphy and Kohler, I think, came out. And they have a regression line, a slope, that shows, hey, the point at which you hit a 500 calorie deficit is where we don't start to see, changes in lean mass anymore. Bigger deficits, on average, lean mass. Smaller deficits, on average, lean mass gain. Awesome. So someone might look at our meta-regression, and if they don't think about the inclusion criteria or this as a meta-regression within a meta-regression, they might go, oh, well, you didn't find the same thing. You found no difference in the slope between a 300 or less or a 301 or higher kcal deficit. What's up with that, guys? Well, think about it. Even if we don't look at the sub-analysis, if we look at our overall inclusion criteria, we're looking at far fewer studies than Kohler and Murphy, because Kohler and Murphy's experimental question was, I want to look at all studies where I have 2 variables to extract, not 3, right? We needed to know the energy deficit, because it had to be a deficit to be included in our study. We needed to know the protein intake and the lean mass. They said, hey, I don't care about the protein intake. What's the lean mass change? And then what was the energy status? So they're looking at multiple times more studies than we are, even though it was published a couple of years ago. So their analysis is by definition a more robust, more powerful, more accurate analysis, because our analysis of the deficit is the meta-regression within the meta-regression that is already smaller than theirs. And there's a further concession. Like, we were able to operationally define the body fat ranges based upon our expertise. You know, we did the quartiles and we added the 8%. There's some subject matter knowledge that went into that. We could have done, hey, did you see the one by Kohler and Murphy? They found right around that 500 calorie deficit. So if we were just going to base it off of our expertise, we'd say, you know what, let's look at less than 500 to over 500. Let's see if we can support what they found. So you might be looking at, like, why did you choose 300 calorie deficit, guys? You trying to cook the books? No, we did a median split. Because if we had chose to do a 500 calorie deficit, then we would have fewer comparisons of a larger deficit versus smaller deficit. And it wouldn't be an equal comparison. We'd be running into statistical issues. So there is a concession that you have to give one way or the other. So we chose the median split. So we had an equal number of comparisons on either side of that split. And the median just so happened to be, based upon our inclusion criteria, of a 300 calorie energy deficit, with some less, some more, but an equal number over each side, because the median is the middlemost value in a distribution. So that's just hopefully some more context that explains why we don't really emphasize some of our sub-analyses.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing. So
I was just going to say, yeah, they're explicitly exploratory, you know, so hopefully people will interpret them accordingly. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, so even though they were exploratory, as we kind of mentioned, that we put a lot of thinking into it. So I did have one productive question, for example. Someone asked, well, with the body fat secondary analyses, how do we know that the difference in body fat levels, the average difference in body fat levels between males and females isn't influencing what we're seeing here? Because on average, females have higher body fat levels. So wouldn't they be clustered around the medium to high categories and be absent in the low categories? And I mean, that was a really critical question, because someone obviously looked at the table and cared enough to take a step beyond. And what we did is we created those categories for males and females, like I said before, and we coded them as like low, medium, and high. So in the analysis, it's maybe a bit tricky to explain, but the analysis doesn't operate on, that secondary analysis doesn't operate on actual body fat numbers. It's just operating on low, medium, and high. So low females might be like 20% body fat from off the top of my head, or around that number. Low
12 to 20 for men, but it's 20 to 28 for women. So it accounts for those differences. It counts both as low.
Correct. And the same goes for medium and high. So we've even tried to kind of think about that, and you know, what we got was like this kind of a stepwise increase in the median slope as body fat level decreased, right? And a stepwise increase in probability of that median slope being positive. But when you look at the number of observations in the categories, it's like 10 in the low, 18 in medium, 28 in high. So this is, again, providing us food for thought, right? The median slopes do vary quite a bit. High body fat percentage is 0.04. Low body fat percentage is 0.14. That's for body mass as a protein prescription. The probability is 78% in the high category, 93% in the low category. But then again, there's 10 observations in the low category, 28 in the high. So we kind of have to weigh all that up. And, you know, what you do with that information is kind of up to you as a practitioner, based on what you've experienced in the past, your prior knowledge, what you've seen in mechanistic studies or other studies out there, and then obviously the observed relationships that we're exploring here.
Yeah, it's crazy that there's not a huge body of studies having people with low body fat doing weight loss programs. Who would have thought?
You know, the funny things there are, but they're all case studies, and we couldn't include those because how do you do, you know, how do you wait for their,
yeah, right.
You know, the means, right? Because it's one person. And
yep,
the literature is developing. Trex, do we have time to dive into the questions on the two YouTubes? I have Iron Culture open if you want to open the mass.
maybe we can do like one from each. It's getting pretty late in these parts. We're getting close to the 2-hour mark here.
Well, the good news is we covered most of them. I'll throw one your way, Martin. And this is be useful for anyone who actually does get into research. Nerd question. What is your weapon of choice for systematic reviews? Covidence, Ryan, JBI, or something else? These are software tools to help you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. When it comes to organizing the systematic review, I'm a big Covidence guy. And a lot of universities, you can get a free license. Yeah, so I'm a Covidence guy for that. But then when you're actually crunching the numbers, I'm a big R guy. Martin, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to bat for Covidence because it was created in Melbourne. So I roll with that. I've never had issues with it. And yeah, I mean, I just, ditto everything you said.
Yeah. Helms, any strong feelings?
Well, since the COVID epidemic, I've been staying away from it because I am a COVID denier. So I will use Covidence, but I won't use Covidence. So that's the only Covidence, right?
I don't know. I'm not sure what the proper
it does sound like Covidence is like some kind of like massive, like, like hub of the newest data related to COVID. Like, what is the newest COVID evidence? But no, it's just for pestering people to keep up with their abstract reviews, all your colleagues.
Yeah. Working through thousands and thousands of studies.
Yeah. And there are other questions, but they are unrelated to the protein intake. So I think we can leave it there. And I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Martin Refalo for coming on and for all his hard work on this publication. And I just also really do. One thing I want to say is, responding to critiques, sometimes a bit tongue in cheek, but I think it is a fantastic thing that we're in a time and an era where we can publish a meta-regression on protein intake in lean dieting individuals and be able to do that because we couldn't 10 years ago. I did the best I could. I even contributed one of the studies that may or may not have made it into our meta-regression. I can't remember if it met the inclusion criteria.
Helms, it did.
Yes. So I'm part of the solution. I'm part of the meta-regression itself, the data I did for my master's. But not only that, but that also we can put it out there and people read it, they care, and they give us critique, regardless of whether we agree with it, think it's fair, think it's charitable. This type of thing is truly a dream come true. And I think we really do need to remember that we're living in an exciting time. Yes, it is really frustrating how much information is out there and how easy it is to be at the top of Mount Dunning or Mount Kruger, not realizing it. But the fact that there are so many people who are communicating this information, and we can get the lead author on a meta-regression who is also a coach, also a competitor himself, who's been in the industry and has studied this and been able to put out information. It is something that we would not have dreamed of, Trex, you and I, 15 years ago when we first started grasping at whatever little itty bits of PubMed trivia we could find that could even be loosely applied to the bodybuilding world. So just remember the positives that we have and try not to be too pessimistic or too black-pilled in this game that we're all participating in.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a privilege to do research that people care about. I've talked to some folks in my many years in academia who study topics that are worth studying, but if you go to a dinner party and start talking about it, people are falling asleep, whereas we are lucky to study a topic that people care about, they engage with, and that's definitely a positive thing. And, it's funny, Helms, there used to be a time where, like you said, we were just kind of trying to scratch at anything loosely PubMed adjacent to try to put together something related, relating to evidence for the kind of stuff we do. And things have changed so much. And if anything, it's like, I remember back in the day when you tried to do that and you would write kind of an evidence-based article and people would say, who cares about these pencil neck researchers who they've never been in the trenches. They've never had a bar in their hands. They don't know anything. And the pendulum has swung so far so quickly that there was a comment, somewhat dismissive comment saying, oh, great, a few powerlifters tried to do a stupid meta-regression saying you have to eat more protein. But we have got
coaches.
Powerlifting coaches, yeah.
At least that. So I am no longer just a pencil neck nerd. Now I'm just a powerlifting coach.
Exactly. So we have gotten to the point where when at first everyone was saying you can't do this research unless you lift, now if you're too into lifting, you probably shouldn't be doing research. So we certainly have come full circle. But anyway, I echo what you said. And yeah, tongue in cheek. It's always good fun talking about criticism and having some sense of humor about it. I do want to echo what you said about thanking Martin for his efforts and for joining us on Iron Culture. And I also want to give a shout out to Renaissance Periodization, who very generously covered the fee to make this paper open access. All we had to do was write exactly what they told us, which was very generous of them. And I'm kidding. I don't think they didn't even see the paper until it was published, did they?
No,
I didn't interact with them whatsoever.
No, the beauty of Renaissance periodization, and this is something that is super rare, and it speaks to a true support for the science itself, is they give a lump sum of money to a lab, and they say, spend this as you wish on your research, rather than, I'm funding a study, which I have an interest in, and then you really have to create a firewall for that to be transparently done in a way that doesn't potentially bias the data. So no, big thank.
Yeah, super generous. And at the end of the day, I think they are both to thank and to blame for the fact that people are attacking us left, right, and center, because if it weren't open access, it just would not have the same number of eyes on it. So thank you. And also it's your fault to RP at the same time. So Martin, once again, thanks so much for joining us. Is there anything that you want to add? Anything else that you want to say as we close here?
No, hopefully people found that valuable. And as always, reach out, feedback, questions. We're always happy to answer and help.
Where would a person reach out to you if they were inclined?
They can find me on Instagram. Usually a DM will do the job.
What's your Instagram handle?
Mr. Fitness _.
Mr. Fitness.
Martin Refalo.
Easy to remember, yeah.
And we're going to put his personal phone number in the show notes. Should we check that?
Oh my God, I just made that connection that Martin Refalo
takes people a bit of time to get there.
Yeah, it's taken me years, but here we are. Yeah. Speaking of which, speaking of initials, Helms, I was going to let this blow by, but now that we're on the topic of initials, I have to mention it. I had our paper open as we were doing this, like the PDF version of the paper that's published. The Helms-Trexler inversion strikes again. So people, it's a running joke. Helms and I both, honest to God, get emails for each other sometimes where people say like, hey, Dr. Trexler, I love the pyramids books. Thanks so much for writing them. I had this question about page 89. And I'm like, I'm not him. And if you look on the cover, it will say who wrote this book. But no. So they got our names right in the part that matters up at the author thing, but down at the bottom with like the author bios, they gave me Eric R. Trexler and Eric T. Helms. So we swapped our middle initials. Luckily, everything else is accurate. So they didn't ship me off to New Zealand. But I'm telling you, man, the Trexler Helms swaps, they just keep on coming.
We're going to have to complain to Dr. Guillermo Escalante when we do his podcast on this.
Yeah. So I think that probably does it for tonight. It is worth noting the whole reason we did this podcast was to show people every single week that we are two separate people, but it's not helping. If anything, it's getting worse by the day, but we'll keep trying. Once again, Martin, thanks so much for all your efforts on this paper, for all your efforts just communicating science. I think you did a fantastic job kind of walking us through this paper and sharing your insights. So we really appreciate it. Thanks so much to everyone who joined us in the live chat. Obviously, this episode, we didn't get to as many questions as we usually do, but I think that, the episode was basically about answering the most frequently asked questions that we've been getting bludgeoned with on the internet. So there's certainly some Q&A to be had. But we will be back next week, which I believe will be February 10th. We will be live at the same time we always are. So we look forward to seeing everyone in exactly 1 week. Take care of yourselves and have a fantastic week.